Hey Saints, this is Kent once again doing another recap video for our Sermon on the Mount Bible study. This time we were looking at what was our 10th study, where we looked at Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. Just like in the previous verses, Jesus has been contrasting his teaching with what was given through the law of Moses. And so we're going to start at Matthew 5, verse 31. And we'll see Jesus is talking about the subject of divorce. Matthew 5:31. It was also said, whoever will put away his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Now, in the previous few sections, Jesus actually directly quoted from the law. For example, when he said, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery. But here he doesn't actually quote directly from the law, but like we spoke about in our study, what he was doing was he was paraphrasing what we find in Deuteronomy chapter 24. Now we don't have time to go through that passage right now, but like we did at the study, but it's actually a paraphrase of what you might infer from Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 teaches that if a man puts away his wife and puts a certificate of divorce in her hand, and then he decides that he wants to marry her again, he's not allowed to have her again. Like if he marries someone else, he's not allowed to go back to his original wife. And Jesus infers from that, rightly of course, that the rule was, if you're going to put your wife away, if you no longer want to have be married to the woman that you've married, you have to make it official. You have to give her a certificate of divorce. That's why Jesus says, he who would put away his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. We noticed at the study that, of course, this wasn't the only time Jesus spoke about marriage and divorce. And Jesus explains a little bit more of what the law said and really why the law said it in Matthew 19, when the Pharisees came to him and said, is it right for a man to divorce his wife? Or I think it says, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? So it was implied to them, of course, a man's allowed to put away his wife. We read in Deuteronomy 24, puts a certificate in her hand. He's just not allowed to marry her again. And so they're asking Jesus, testing him, of course, saying, can this be done for any reason? And Jesus' answer says, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder, meaning what God has joined, do not allow man to separate. He quotes from the book of Genesis, where he says, the two shall become one flesh. God has joined them. You're not allowed to separate them. And the Pharisees, possibly rightly confused, saying, well, then why did Moses allow divorce? And this is where Jesus explains kind of the why behind that law. In Deuteronomy 24, he says, put the certificate of divorce in her hand, and then she's free to marry someone else. Had the man not put the certificate of divorce in her hand, what position would she then be in if he's kicking her out of his house? If she wanted to be righteous, if she wanted to obey the law, she would have to stay loyal to her husband who had just kicked her out of the house, and she would basically be like an old maid. She wouldn't be able to marry anyone else. She would be on her own without a household to care for her, to protect her, to provide for her. And so in order to find a husband, she would have to marry someone else while still being married to him, thus committing adultery. And so the law of Moses said, because you guys are putting away your wives, I'm going to institute this policy. It's called divorce, and it means she's free to marry someone else. And once you put that divorce certificate in her hand, you are not allowed to marry her again. I don't want, and kind of what God is saying through Moses, he didn't want marriage to become some transactional thing that you jump into and jump out of. Like if you're going to put her away, she's not yours anymore forever. And so the way Jesus phrases that to the Pharisees is, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted them to divorce. But from the beginning, it was not so. And so Jesus says, yes, the law allowed for divorce, and it was because the hardness of heart of the men of Israel, in order to protect women who would have been in this vulnerable position, he allowed divorce so that she could be free to marry someone else without herself becoming an adulteress. She'd now be freed from that marriage bond. And so the next verse, Matthew 5:32, I'll just read that again real quick. In verse 31, it was also said, whoever will put away his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Verse 32, but I say to you that everyone who puts away his wife, unless it is because of fornication, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a put away woman commits adultery. Now I want to focus first on just those last two clauses. Makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a put away woman commits adultery. This shows a little bit of what was going on there in Deuteronomy 24, why he's permitting divorce. If you put your wife away under the law of Moses, give her a certificate of divorce so that she's not an adulteress if she marries someone else. But now, Jesus says, what I say to you, the same Jesus who in Matthew 19 said, from the beginning it was not so. Really what Jesus is doing is he's restoring the marriage command for his disciples back to what God's original intention was. If you put her away, you're causing her to commit adultery. Why would that be? Because she'd be marrying someone else, and I'm no longer allowing this divorce provision. Moses allowed it because of the hardness of your heart. But I say to you, if you put her away, you've caused her to commit adultery. And not only have you caused her to commit adultery, whatever this new husband that she finds, someone who's going to be able to provide for her and take care of her, he's also committing adultery. Whoever marries a put away woman commits adultery. Why would he be committing adultery? Because she's still married to her first husband. I'm no longer allowing this divorce provision. And this was, like all the other teachings we've seen in the Sermon on the Mount, it references the Old Testament law, but it takes it a step higher. Not just murder, but anger in your heart. Not just adultery, but lust in your heart. Not just if you divorce, give her a certificate, but I'm restoring the original righteous command that God gave. The two shall become one flesh. What God joins together, do not let man separate. I wanted to read a quote from this book, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, that I think phrases it well. This is referring to the Lord. The inventor of the human machine was telling us that its two halves, the male and the female, were made to be combined together in pairs, not simply on a sexual level, but totally combined. And skipping to the next paragraph. As a consequence, Christianity teaches that marriage is for life. I just want to pause right there. Actually, I'll read the next sentence. There is, of course, a difference here between different churches. Some do not admit divorce at all. Some allow it reluctantly in very special cases. And we're going to come back to this quote in just a second. But notice he said, what God has joined together, they are one flesh. The two become one, and therefore the Christian view is that divorce should, for some Christians, should never be done, and for others, it should only be done in very special circumstances. And the reason why he says that is because of this other clause that we see here in verse 32. Unless it is because of fornication. Some Christians understand what Jesus to be saying here is everything that I just said. I don't want divorce. I want it to be the way it was from the beginning. What God joins together, let not man put asunder. But there's an exception clause if the woman commits adultery, which is what they'd understand to be saying, lest it be for fornication. So the argument goes, if one of the two partners commits adultery, then the marriage bond is already severed and you're free to put them away. You're free to divorce them. Now, among evangelical commentators that I've read, I actually take the minority view that this is not an exception clause, that he means something different by that. The reason why I say that, a few reasons, but number one is Parallel passages to this verse are found in Mark 10, verse 11 and 12, and Luke 16, verse 18, and neither of them contain the clause. And in fact, the Luke verse says, everyone who marries a woman put away commits adultery. It would seem to me that if you say, like, you have an early Christian who only has a copy of one of the Gospels, he doesn't have a full New Testament like we have. If you were to read Jesus' words and he were to say, everyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery, would assume he meant everyone. Not that there are certain cases where that's not the case because they might have had adultery previously, but everyone. So why then is the clause there in Matthew? Well, I think an important thing to notice is that Jesus doesn't say, um, unless it is because of her adultery, he makes her commit adultery. He says, unless it is because of fornication, he makes her commit adultery. Those are two different Greek words for fornication and adultery. And the one for adultery is specific to any sexual impropriety for someone who's married, where fornication generally refers to someone who's not married. And so when we see what Jesus says, unless it be because of fornication, I believe he's talking not about what was done by a married person, but by an unmarried person. But you say, why then is he saying divorce, adultery, and wife if he's talking about an unmarried person? The Greek word for wife, the word gune, is really the exact same word for the word woman generally. Greek does not have a separate word for woman and wife. Same thing for man. The word aner means man or male, and then it also means husband, depending on the context. And so it's kind of like if you were to say, in English, we'd say, this is his wife. In Greek, they would just say, this is his woman. And we would understand that they're saying the two of them are joined by marriage. And whenever it's possessive, you generally will translate it with wife or husband. But not always. There's one case in the first chapter of Matthew where Joseph, Jesus' adopted father, and Mary are described using these terms, though it clearly says that they were not yet married. She was his betrothed, but it refers to her as his gune, his woman or his wife. And if you remember the story, he found that she was with child, and he, of course, thought she was guilty, not of adultery, but of fornication. And in that instance, it seems Jesus is saying, and a betrothal would have been a more, just more serious then than an engagement is generally today. But it's like something you should still honor. If you've gotten betrothed to someone, you should honor that commitment to marry them. However, if you find that they're guilty of fornication, you should do, or are permitted to do, what Joseph intended to do, which was put her away quietly, according to Matthew chapter 1. He didn't want to put her to a public spectacle, but he did want to not go forward with the marriage to someone he thought was guilty of fornication during their betrothal. Of course, you know the story. The angel comes to Joseph and explains that no, she's conceived of the Holy Spirit. It's the Son of God in her womb. But what Joseph understood was, we're not married, we're betrothed, and she's guilty of fornication. The righteous thing for me to do, or that I'm allowed to do, is put her away quietly. And Jesus is not disagreeing with what Joseph did. However, they were not married. And that's why he doesn't say, lest it be for adultery. He says, lest it be for fornication. And if that's the understanding of this passage, that he's talking about fornication prior or during betrothal rather than adultery during marriage, it explains why in Mark and Luke, he can just say, whoever marries a woman put away commits adultery with her. Because the reader would understand he's talking about a husband and wife separating. The divorce provision, which the law allowed for, Jesus says, I no longer allow for. So that's my understanding of what Jesus is saying. Not just like the law said, if you put a certificate of divorce in her hand, you're not allowed to marry her again. But not even what most evangelical scholars understand, which is that there's one divorce provision, which is for adultery. I think Jesus is saying no divorce, period. You say, well, what if I have a spouse who is unfaithful to me? I think if we just consider what Jesus says about the level of righteousness that he's been demanding from his disciples throughout the Sermon on the Mount, and especially in the next couple of sections, he doesn't say that your righteousness is going to be contingent upon the righteousness of someone else. He doesn't say that if you are sinned against, you're therefore allowed to abandon your marriage vow. I don't know any marriage vow that stated, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, till death do us part, unless you're unfaithful. Normally it says, in sickness and in health, till death do us part, period. And it seems to me, Jesus is saying, when you make that wedding vow, when you make that marriage commitment, you honor it. So I was just going to read a quick section out of my book. Again, we're going through Theirs is the Kingdom loosely. It's my commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. As Jesus will explain later, this is the last paragraph in this section, page 93. As Jesus will explain later, the righteousness of the disciple is to be patterned after that of God himself, Matthew 5:45 and 48. Through the prophet Hosea, God actually used this exact example of an unfaithful spouse as an illustration for the way that Israel had treated him while they were committing idolatry. He commanded Hosea to marry a prostitute so that he could experience the abandonment that God felt as his people were unfaithful to him. Did God use Israel's sin as an opportunity to abandon his own faithfulness? Of course not. Rather, he commanded Hosea to, quote, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods. Hosea 3, verse 1. If Jesus' disciples are to follow the pattern of God's own righteousness, certainly they are not to see the unfaithfulness of another as an opportunity to abandon their own commitment to be faithful. So that's my understanding of that passage. If you do disagree with me, understand you're actually in the majority opinion among evangelicals at least. But it is important to see that actually, let me let C.S. Lewis phrase it. Because you remember he was saying that as a consequence, Christianity teaches that marriage is for life. There is, of course, a difference here between different churches. Some do not admit divorce at all. Some allow it reluctantly in very special cases. It is a great pity that Christians should disagree about such a question, but, and this is the point I wanted to emphasize, for an ordinary layman, the thing to notice is that the churches all agree with one another about marriage a great deal more than any of them agrees with the outside world. I mean, they all regard divorce as something like cutting up a living body, a kind of surgical operation. Some of them think the operation so violent it cannot be done at all, my view. Others admit it, but only as a desperate remedy in extreme cases. They are all agreed that it is more like having both your legs cut off than it's like dissolving a business partnership, or even deserting a regiment, I think referring to a military regiment. What they all disagree with is the modern view that it is a simple readjustment of partners to be made whenever people feel they are no longer in love with one another or when either of them falls in love with someone else. And I would add to that, it's certainly Christians are much more united on their understanding of marriage than the world's view. But I'd say even compared to what was given in the law of Moses, where because there was an understood hardness of heart of the people of Israel, God, through Moses, allowed them to put their wives away so long as they gave them a certificate, meaning they were allowed to marry someone else. Jesus, for his disciples, says, no, that hard heart provision, I'm doing away with. The Holy Spirit is going to be within you. You're going to have the very righteousness of God able to be lived out through you. And so for my disciples, we're restoring marriage to what it was in God's original creation before sin ever even entered the picture. In Genesis 2, before the fall in Genesis 3, he said, the two shall become one flesh. So Jesus says in Matthew 19, what God has joined together, Do not let man separate. So next time, we're going to continue through the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to be looking at what Jesus has to say about vows, and he'll be again contrasting with what we see in the Old Testament. So see you then.